You are listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For today's episode, I had the opportunity to interview Amanda Blackwood. Amanda is a human trafficking survivor, the host of 2 podcasts, and the author of multiple books. I'm here with Amanda Blackwood, who is an author and human trafficking survivor. Amanda, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thank you very much, Aaron. It's nice to be here with you.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
So, as you said, I am an author and a human trafficking survivor. That's usually how people recognize me. But I'm also a published author 13 times. I have a trauma recovery mentorship. I have a full career, side career as a professional artist. I actually have a solo exhibit going on right now in the city of Denver. And I am a very happily married woman with 1 child of my own, 2 stepkids, and 6 cats.
Now, some of the books you've written are the Growth from Darkness workbooks, and who are those for, and how many of them are there in the series total?
So, as far as right now, there's only 1 that's currently published. There's another one that's coming up very soon, and then the final 2 will be coming out next year. So those books are... the first one is about the stages of trauma. So basically it's written for anybody who's ever experienced trauma and they're trying to figure out where they are in life now and how they navigate from here. The next book in the series is currently being worked on, but will be out shortly. It's the trauma reactions, what the long-term consequences are of not dealing with them, and how to fight back against them. So this one is written basically for the people who know where they are in their journey, and they're ready to really start fighting back and retraining their brain. The third book is about setting healthy boundaries. This is for basically anybody and everybody because we all have troubles with that, especially with social media being what it is now. We allow the wrong people into our lives sometimes, and we don't know how to say no. We're taught not to say no in a lot of ways. The fourth book is about supporting survivors. So this is for the people who are trying to figure out how do they deal with somebody who is dealing with trauma, somebody who's gone through it, somebody who's trying to learn how to fight back. How do you navigate this with them? How do you walk alongside of them? How do you show them that you love them and support them without being overbearing or triggering?
Now, you've written some books outside of your Growth from Darkness series. Without spoiling too much of some of your other books, what are some of them about?
3 of them are actually a post-apocalyptic series. The main character is based on who I believed at the time I would have been if the lies about me had been true. I always tell people who better to predict the end of the world than somebody who's already lived through it. With me being a survivor of human trafficking, I really have seen some of the worst of humanity. So while that is a component of the series, it's also about finding hope in some of the most unlikely of places and learning how to trust people again. While I was writing the book, these are exactly the things that I was navigating in my own life. So it's very real, and it's very much written from actual life experience, as well as having some of the science fiction post-apocalyptic stuff thrown in there too. I also have a historical fiction book that's about my grandmother's life in the 1930s and 40s. She's portrayed as a wing walker. If people don't know what a wing walker is, that is somebody who would do stunts walking on the wings of a biplane while the plane was in flight, flying at speeds over 100 miles an hour. And her first love, his name was Arthur in the book, he was a real person. Their love was a real love, and there is a real-life murder mystery in the book that I did not discover until after the book was published. They did find the body, and he's listed as a John Doe. I have several books about my own personal experiences. My autobiography specifically is probably my top seller, and that one is called Custom Justice.
Now, are all your books self-published, or all your books traditionally published, or are some self-published and others traditionally published?
It's kind of an odd thing for me. Back when I first started trying to get my very first book published, I had struck a deal with somebody through Penguin Publishing. My go-between at the time, I guess you can call him my agent, that was communicating for us, decided that he was in love with me, and that if I didn't quit my job and go marry him and move to Texas and live happily forever after, he wasn't going to help me anymore. And it was then that I decided, I'm not going to allow this to happen. I've had enough people try to exploit me in my life. I'm done with this whole mess, and I didn't even try for a traditional publisher again. Instead, I started my own publishing company. So all of my books are published through my own publishing company, and I have now finally started helping other survivors of trafficking to publish their books as well.
I'm going to try not to flip out here, but you're saying someone who either was a literary agent or claimed to be one tried to force you to move in with him hundreds of miles away?
That's correct. I was living in California and was very happy at the time, and he wanted me to move to Texas to be with him.
Yeah, that has to be traumatizing for someone who had already endured human trafficking.
Oh, absolutely. Anytime you feel that you're being exploited, it can be extremely traumatic for somebody. I didn't even see it that way at the time. I just saw him as being a dishonest shyster. I didn't understand what exploitation was. But when I finally figured it out, I started to look back and I realized how absolutely dirty this was. And I'd already lost contact with him, and it had been several years. So at that point, I didn't even have the option to warn anybody else. But that's actually why I started my publishing company, because I didn't want this happening to other people, specifically to other survivors of trauma, other survivors of human trafficking.
Now, moving back on to another question that's purely about writing. If you have a typical writing routine, what is that like for you?
I go into my writing office, so my husband has made sure that I have a very nice space for me to work in. This room is filled with 1940s antiques, hats, shoes, gloves, dresses, all that stuff that I actually do use and have used in the past as a museum guide. And I sit down typically at the computer to first set up the music. So I have a sound system that is set up to my computer, and I'll set it up and start playing classical music. Usually I'll start with something like George Winston. Once the music gets going, I'll close my eyes for a moment. I will feel the music. I will think about what it is that the music is making me think or see in my mind. And I will take just a couple of moments to write about what that specifically is. Once I get that out of my system, I have done kind of basically a warm-up exercise. It's like stretching before you go for a run. Once I get that out of my system, then I can go to whatever book it is that I've been working on recently, and I can usually do some pretty good damage on how many pages I've got.
Now, how many podcasts do you host?
I have 3 currently. There have been requests that I do certain other podcasts, but I'm having to turn down those requests right now. I'm just too busy.
Now, what are each of your podcasts called, and what type of content can be found on a typical episode of each of your podcasts?
My main podcast is called The Survivors. It can be found by either Googling my name or just going to any podcast search bar and typing in The Survivors by Amanda Blackwood. That one is specifically about interviewing other people who have written about overcoming their own traumas. So they are stories of hope. They're stories of overcoming, stories of perseverance, and stories of finding love or success after having gone through something where people feel like there's nothing else that they can do with their lives. It really is about overcoming the odds. The second podcast is called Growth from Darkness. I co-host this with a friend of mine from Australia. She is absolutely amazing and hilarious. So we start talking about these things and we have fun every time. And you wouldn't think this would necessarily be a fun subject. We break down what the trauma reactions are and their long-term consequences and how to fight back against them. But we also discuss when these trauma reactions have shown up in our own lives. So we do discuss things that can be a little bit scary and difficult to that really discuss sometimes. But one of my favorites, looking back now, was when we discussed road rage. We laughed so hard looking back and recognizing how off we were and how triggered we had been in these moments where we had these absolute raging spits of anger at total strangers because of something that they didn't mean to do on purpose. And it's hilarious looking back on it, but it's also our way of kind of apologizing to the world and saying, hey, if this ever happened to you, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. The third podcast is called That's a Phobia. And hilariously, I try to pronounce what the phobia is, that I spell it. And I'm dyslexic, so that can also be funny. And then I try to pronounce it one more time. I talk about what the phobia is and if anybody in history or of fame has ever been known to have this phobia. So the episodes are only about 3 to 5 minutes long. It's pretty short.
Now, if you can give a kind of G or PG rated description of some of the human trafficking you went through, and what helped you to heal from the trauma you endured as a human trafficking victim?
So kind of the short cliff notes, I was... most victims of human trafficking are no stranger to early childhood abuse. It started pretty young for me. The earliest I can remember being abused, I was about 4, but it happened repeatedly throughout my preteen and teen years. By the time I was 18, I was looking for love and affection wherever I could get it. And predators tend to pick up on that. They notice this stuff. They know how to promise you what it is that you're lacking in your life. So at 18, I was dating a man who was more than twice my age. He recognized that I really didn't have a stable home, so he offered me a place to stay, and I started living with him. And once I was living there, he knew that I was dependent on him, and he could get me to do whatever he wanted. He was the first person to traffic me. After that happened, I left, and I went to go and stay with my grandmother in Daytona Beach, Florida. So the first incident was in Arizona. In Florida, I went to go and stay with my grandmother because I had injured myself at a job and needed to have knee surgery. And when I got there, my parents had told her she's running away from her problems again. And if you take her in, we'll never speak to you again. So I was left on the side of the road at 10:30 at night at the Daytona Beach bus station. And again, predators can spot when somebody is in need. A young couple came and found me. He was 22, she was 15. They became my landlords and then my owners, and they sold me to a man named Esteban. When I got out of there, and thankfully I had grown up in the 80s and I had watched a lot of MacGyver growing up, and Richard Dean Anderson is absolutely my hero. I love the man to pieces, but watching that show is what saved my life. I MacGyvered my way out of the room, and that's actually written about in a book called Detailed Pieces of a Shattered Dream. Once I got out of there, I left for California. I lived out there for a long time. This was during the age of internet dating, so about 2004 to 2011 is when I really got to know one particular man. And he eventually asked me to get a fiancé visa to move to Scotland to go be with him. It took him 7 years to get me there, and it took him 7 days to start trafficking me once he did. So I was trafficked 3 completely separate times in my life, 3 completely separate incidences. Every single instance is completely different. But what a lot of people don't realize is that human trafficking typically happens to one person an average of 7 times. The fact that it only happened to me 3 times is a bit of a miracle. But it's also important to recognize the actual definition of human trafficking so people understand that what it is being portrayed in the movies and media is not necessarily what human trafficking typically looks like. So looking at the definition, you don't want to go to Google or Wikipedia or anything like that. These are fallible resources. You want to go somewhere like the Department of Homeland Security. They define human trafficking as the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain labor or sex acts from another person. If you notice, there's no mention of transportation. There's no mention of money. There's no mention of age. So we tend to think of human trafficking as only happening to young children here in the U.S. More than 3/4 of all victims are over the age of 18. That means only 1/4 of all victims are minors. There's no mention of transportation because human smuggling and human trafficking are two completely separate issues that both need to be addressed and are both a big problem. And while they do overlap, one does not equal the other. And that's the same with prostitution. These are all separate issues. Again, there's no mention of money. Coercion can be, commercial sex acts can be anything down to and including trade and drug and guns and whatever it is that somebody wants or needs. You can trade sex for this. And it's a horrible, horrible living. It's terrible. One of the greatest things that helped me once I got out, of course, was therapy. Also writing and artwork. And I didn't realize how much of a role this was going to play in my life until I got through the therapy. Writing had always been really helpful for me. But once I got through the therapy, I told my therapist, I think I'm ready to write the book. And she got really excited about it. I wrote the entire autobiography in the month of December of 2020. It was released on June 19th, 2021, which was my 10-year anniversary of freedom from trafficking. So if you do the math, that was only 12 years ago that I was still being trafficked. And when the book came out, she asked me, well, what are you going to do next? And I said, I don't know. She said, I want you to try painting. And she sent somebody over with some paints, some brushes, some canvases. And she said, just have fun with it. I don't care what it looks like. I said, that's good because most of the time I've ever tried to paint anything, it looks like a multicolored snowman laying on his side. I was not an artist. Now I am painting book covers of my own. I'm painting book covers for other people. I do have this solo art exhibit. I have sold artwork around the world, and I've got one piece that's hanging up in a home for human trafficking survivors in Chicago, Illinois. And Chicago Tribune actually wrote an article about that piece.
Now, what is one thing you wish you could tell someone who is going through what you went through?
We have grown up our entire lives constantly hearing what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and stop believing that. Stop saying that. Stop putting any faith in that. It's a lie. The man who coined the phrase, his name was Friedrich Nietzsche. He died in the 1800s in an insane asylum. I think we can let that one go now. The truth is that we've always had this strength within us. Sometimes we just have to dig a little deeper to find it. And honestly, finding the help that you need is not a weakness. Asking for help is not a weakness. It is absolutely a strength. That's why it's so difficult to do it. Not knowing what resources are available to you is the same thing as not having those resources. But we live in the age of the internet now. If you're going through domestic violence, if you're going through human trafficking, reach out to those national hotlines that treat specifically those cases. The reason they were designed, the reason they exist is because of you, because they want to help you. These are not people who are out there specifically trying to exploit you. They really do want to help, or they wouldn't be there in the first place.
I have one final question. What is one thing that you love about yourself that is not about or related to your physical appearance in any way?
I love this question. Today, I would probably have to say that it is my integrity. If I say I'm going to do something, I do it. Unless it's completely impossible, unless I'm so sick that I can't even get out of bed, I show up at the parties. I'm there for my friends. I'll drive across town to be there to make sure that they get the help that they need if they call me. I have this thing within me that says your integrity has occasionally been the only thing you've had left. Are you really, really wanting and willing to risk it now? I'm really proud of my integrity.
And before I sign off, I want to thank you for what happened when we first tried to do this interview, and you had some kind of issue with your computer and you had to postpone. I thank you for communicating that with me as soon as you realized there would be a problem so we could reschedule this interview.
Yeah, that was actually my microphone broke. I actually bought a new one and overnighted it to me so that I'd have it the next morning because there was no way I could do anything. I had completely lost everything. Nobody could hear a word I was saying.
Well, I can hear you fine now, and I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author Podcast.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Aaron, for having me today. I really appreciate you, and I really appreciate your podcast. I love that the Heartland Author is giving a voice to the authors out there. We need more people like you.
Amanda was an amazing guest to be able to interview for this podcast, and I hope y'all listen to her podcast. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at AuthorAAC and on Instagram at AACScribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.